This is the Michael Bryan Show. Hi everyone, welcome back to the show, and today I am joined with Holly Baxter. She's an IFBB Bikini Pro and an online physique coach with over 13 years of experience. So we are discussing women's health, fitness, and how to get the best physique and life possible. Trying to be as healthy as you can. Holly, thanks so much for joining me today.
I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
So let's start with some of the things that people get wrong, because health and fitness can be a weird world once you enter it, people wanting to lose weight or get fitter or possibly even build some muscle as well. So what is it that people get wrong?
I think for women, generally speaking, it's perhaps having a lack of patience to get where they want to go. And then not necessarily spending enough time, perhaps even in like a muscle building phase. I think for multiple reasons. Obviously, there's a lot of benefits to having more lean tissue in terms of how that impacts your metabolic health. But I think also in terms of how that impacts your metabolism. So I guess what I mean by the latter is the more muscle tissue you have, the higher your metabolic requirements are, meaning you get more flexibility to eat more food, which is always a plus for most of us. And it can also facilitate fat loss, which I know a lot of women are striving for. So I think too much time is probably spent chasing fat loss, and not enough time is spent trying to acquire lean tissue. And sadly, muscle grows very slowly. If we look to a lot of the research in this area, generally speaking, over an 8 to 12-week study intervention, for example, the average change in muscle thickness that we might expect to see is somewhere between 0.2 to 0.3 of a centimeter. So we are talking millimeters of change over a number of months. And I think most of us would probably expect to see results a little bit faster than that in terms of, muscle growth. But that is the reality. So I think from my experience over the years with lots of women wanting to improve their body composition and health as well, is that they're just simply not spending enough time focusing on the building component, and instead they are chasing fat loss. So it's probably the main thing that I see, but I'm sure there are many others as well.
I think the whole patience element is an interesting one, because I think there'll be people out there that might change what they're doing when they are not seeing results as quickly as they would hope. And then I would imagine it's like starting again every time you try and change something.
Yeah, and look, I think that would be something else that we see quite often is just program hopping, changing up the diet, changing up the training program. And I mean, there are so many ways that you can accomplish fat loss. There are so many ways that you can do that through nutrition and through training. So, yeah, I think ultimately you can stick to the same thing for a really long period of time and it will achieve certain results. But I think there's something to be said for having a little bit of variety, not only in your diet, but also in your training too. I think when it comes to like the program that I do for myself and for my clients, often the main reason that we would change somebody's training program, for instance, is just due to like excitement and, program enjoyment, not necessarily because their goals have suddenly changed. But, having some exercise variety and changing things up allows them to stay motivated and, consistent towards that overall goal. And the same thing can be said for nutrition. I mean, there are many ways that you can implement fat loss. Ultimately, the driving factor there is going to be caloric restriction. But there are hundreds of different approaches, if not thousands, depending on your personal, food preferences. Sorry. I think it's a positive thing for women and men as well to recognize that there are many ways to get there. It's about, finding what's really a good fit for you and in your personal lifestyle.
I think the short thing that you said there of trying to fit it into someone's lifestyle, I think that we need to possibly even look into that, because the amount of people that would have different jobs that don't necessarily help them with their health, but then it saps their energy, or they haven't got the energy or motivation to then hit the gym as well. So how big of a part does lifestyle actually play?
Oh, significant. I've had conversations with clients that, we've kind of had to say, look, based on the amount of hours that you're working and all of these other obligations and responsibilities that you have, this is what's left. And, it may not necessarily be sufficient for them to accomplish their goals. So, in those situations, I mean, I've had conversations with people where we've had to make adjustments to their career paths, and they've been like open and willing to do that, just in recognition of how many years they've been struggling, and it's really the job that they've been doing that's prevented them to do it, especially sedentary jobs where you're not able to kind of get up and move around. I relate to those people, as my job is heavily, I guess, research based or coaching, where I'm just sitting for many hours every day. So the only activity that I get is something that is planned, and it requires a lot of like effort to fit that in if you're extremely busy. So I think sometimes there's, a need for a consideration of career change if it's that burdensome to people. Perhaps maybe a more realistic approach would just be adjusting expectations around the timeframes that it can take to get to where you want to go. And I think my role as a coach is to help provide people that vision by, forecasting over, the time period that we're working together, based on the number of hours that you have to commit to exercise and based on what you are willing and able to sacrifice in terms of nutrition. Here's how many weeks it might actually take us to get there. And we can be pretty accurate with those types of things, because a lot of this just comes down to like a mathematic equation. Easier said than done. Obviously, our food choices and our training and things are a lot more complex than math. But I mean, ultimately, that's kind of what we're following and then we fit our lifestyle around that.
What I find quite fascinating is the whole equation element, because it's funny how people are almost obsessed with sets and reps and calories and proteins and fats, and it becomes this very analog sort of way of seeing things. Like it's all very numbers based, and then when we look at some of the things that people struggle with, it's almost like it's the opposite end of that. Like if you look, okay, we'll do 3 sets of 10 or 5 sets of 8 or whatever it is, that's quite straightforward to then carry out into the gym, but it's getting there. It's trying to put as much effort into those sets and reps as possible. It seems to be most of the problems that we're experiencing are not actually the gym side of things, it's everything else.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's the ability to be consistent with getting there. Absolutely. So, yeah, I think a look inwards is often a helpful place to start. I think just trying to identify like what are the roadblocks, what are the obstacles. And I think for a lot of us, it is really time. I know for me, I work like an 80 to 100-hour week sometimes. I have several companies, and I keep busy all over the weekends as well. But I have to be really strategic. I have a calendar that I follow to the T, and that really keeps me on track. And, most evenings before I go to bed, I'm checking what time I need to be up, what time all of my meetings are, and I have scheduled where my training needs to be, right down to the driving time to get to the gym. Because if I didn't follow that, life gets in the way, and it certainly makes it a lot more difficult to be consistent. So, yeah, I think you need to have a plan. And I think if you're just hoping that it'll just fall into place, and that it's a passive thing, then, I think that's where we start to kind of run into trouble. So I think being organized and having a really good schedule can be incredibly helpful for a lot of people. I never realized how many folks don't even have a calendar. They're kind of just flying by the seat of their pants, which I think you can get away with to a certain extent. But if you are a busy person and you have a lot of, I guess, different responsibilities that pull you in different directions, whether it's children, busy career, managing multiple relationships, and then maybe some personal hobbies kind of tied in outside of that, our time kind of gets sucked a little bit. So, yeah, I think being organized and, planning for your exercise, even for me, like when it comes to my nutrition, my week would not go as successfully as it does unless I had a day where, I've sat down, worked out what meals I might like to have for the week, that I look forwards to, and then, making sure that I get the time to actually do a little bit of meal prep. I mean, just for the convenience of it, as opposed to having, a structured meal plan. I think the meal prep component is a really important part of that. Otherwise, I would probably be scrambling to look for things in my refrigerator. And when you are time pressed, you often look for the most simple, easy solution, and it's not always the one that aligns with your health goals. So, yeah, I think having a plan is critical.
What I find quite interesting is some people actually have like weird little habits that they do. So that whether it's an app that they use, I would actually set alarms on my phone, and that would actually act as my assistant. So I'd actually have an alarm set every sort of, I don't know, half an hour or something, reminding me to do something. And that was a little weird little hack that I came up with. Do you have any, or is it anything that your clients use to keep on track or remind themselves to do things or try and get away from this whole time pressed element?
Oh goodness, that's a tough question. I do like the idea that you have like a little reminder that goes off on your phone. I've definitely recommended that to clients, and I know like during a fat loss phase for me, as calories become a little bit more restrictive, and obviously, there's a necessary part where it becomes hard, you are hungry at times. I think being able to kind of evenly distribute your meals throughout the day can be helpful. And if setting a timer on your phone or some kind of notification that's like, okay, all right, 4 hours has passed, go and have your next meal, or just as a little reminder to, hey, remember it's okay to eat. I think a lot of us get distracted in, the busyness of our day and hours can pass. So yeah, I really like that. That's a great strategy. But for me, I mean, I have developed like multiple applications over the years. So one of those was a nutrition coaching app, and it had a built-in food tracker as well. So I think tracking macros has certainly made it easier for me to remain accountable, and also learn about the constituents of food. I think coming in as a dietitian from school is certainly helpful. We have to know a lot about food, which is a massive advantage. So I can see where if you don't have that background, a food knowledge and just understanding of nutrition in general is a little bit more challenging. But there is a massive benefit, I think, to learning about foods through tracking what you eat. So I know that that's not necessarily like a tick or like a habit or something like that, but I think that in and of itself can be a really valuable exercise. And doing it for a few years, I think, to really refine that skill, because ultimately it is a time consuming task to track your macros, but it's not something that I think you have to, stick to indefinitely. And eventually you can kind of step away from that. I mean, I tracked macros for goodness, probably 15 years. I remember using the old Calorie King books prior to there even being, applications that would do this for you. And now I can say that when I'm not competing and I'm not restricting calories to hop on stage, I do mindfully eat. And I don't know that I would be as good as or able to do that if I hadn't had 15 years of paying attention to foods and also exploring like recipe creation myself. So all of the things that I love eating when I go out of the house from restaurants and takeout. At some point in my adult life, I've also explored like trying to make them at home. I have many recipe books now that have afforded me the ability to do that, which is awesome. And I feel a lot more confident just mindfully eating, which again frees up so much time because you aren't, bound to a phone. And you also get to practice a little bit more, mindful eating. You can listen into your hunger cues and to a certain extent, self-regulate or auto-regulate. And maintain a healthy body composition. So, of course, when you're trying to be very specific for something like a competition, I think macro tracking is like the best way to go because it is so accurate. Provided that you're doing the work to get accurate weights of things and serving sizes and portions. But when you're not striving for extreme leanness or a very conditioned physique, it's definitely achievable to maintain that kind of body composition, just eating mindfully when you've got some good food knowledge. So I'm sorry that doesn't necessarily answer your question. I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but it's usually an individual case by case basis. What's the client struggling with, and we just try to come up with proactive solutions and things to kind of help them individually.
I'd be curious about any little known food facts. So whether it's helping people get stronger or fat loss maybe as well. Are there any little tricks that you've came up with because you've had a lot of years as a dietitian, competition athlete as well? What are some of the things that people might not be aware of, maybe to make their fat loss or weight loss journey that little bit easier?
I think when it comes to food specifically, there are so many great products out there now that are, I guess, targeted towards people that are accomplishing or trying to accomplish fat loss. Just as an example, I mean, I grew up in Australia, but I was also very much engrossed in Italian cuisine. I think my parents loved Italian food. So I grew up on like spaghetti bolognese and lots of pasta dishes and lots of bread and things like this. And, generally speaking, those can be quite calorically dense depending on how they are prepared. My love for those foods has not changed at all over the years. In fact, I am just a foodie at heart. I eat out, 2 or 3 times over the weekends, even as a competitor. It's not like I follow this restrictive diet where I can't go out and enjoy those things. I'm just mindful with selections. But there are really great options now that try to, or at least attempt to mimic some of these like more calorically dense foods. So, for example, there are probably at least 4 or 5 different kind of pasta imitation products. Some of them are made out of like fibrous materials like shirataki. There's another product that's made from palmini, and these are basically a vegetable or a fibrous material of some sort that's, I guess, created in the shape of pasta, and they have commandeered like all of the pasta varieties. So, I can still enjoy those things, right up until, the day before I'm basically hopping on stage. Sure, it's not exactly the same in terms of its flavor, but a lot of these products will take on like the sauce that you're cooking with. And, it's still really satiable. Another good example might be, at least in the breads, grains, and cereals family of foods, the high fiber wraps. So, I mean, they are also extremely versatile. You can use those for sweet dishes. You can use those for your savory dishes. I mean, I make pizzas on those high fiber bread wraps. I use them as the layers in lasagna, believe it or not. I mean, you just have to be creative. And I think that comes from, again, a little bit of intention, a bit of effort. This does not happen passively. But, if you are somebody that really likes food, as I do, I think you kind of have to make it a priority to explore like some of those options and be okay with a little bit of a compromise. Otherwise, if you don't, I mean, then it becomes very difficult to kind of eat at a calorie target that might afford you the luxury of losing, weight to the extent that you'd like. So yeah, I think there are other like low calorie bread products as well. Now I don't use these when I'm not dieting specifically, but I mean you can buy breads these days and have a nice like healthy, salad sandwich or any kind of sandwich for that matter, a toasted cheese ham, pineapple sandwich. That's something that I do often. But you can get breads that are like 40 calories a slice. Now, it's not my favorite. I much prefer the, hearty, grainy bread if I'm, not in a calorically restricted state. But I mean, there are just lots of options. And I think, pay attention in the grocery store. There are so many different things. I think something else that I have personally found to be helpful is just staying extremely well hydrated. And I use a lot of diet soda, believe it or not. I think in Australia we were limited for like selections and options. And I would always get flavor fatigue because we really were limited to like Diet Coke or Pepsi Zero and then maybe like Sprite. So those are about the extent of our options when I was living in Australia many years ago. But at least here in the US, there are countless brands that, have every flavor under the sun diet soda. So again, specifically when I am dieting, but I do also adopt some of these habits, just while I'm at maintenance or not considering trying to be in fat loss. But I think having a good variety of those types of products, to sip on, which gives you some taste, gives you a little bit of a sweet hit, and might hold you over until, you have your next intentional meal. So, yeah, I'm a big fan of the low calorie soda beverages. And there are juices like that now as well, if you're a juice fan. So I'm certainly just not even scraping the surface with all of the options that are available. But yeah, I think going for easy, simple, convenient options. I'm a big advocate of some of the protein bars and ready to drink protein shakes. I'll have at least two of those every day as like one of my snacks, just so that I'm, not spending hours and hours in the kitchen when I'm trying to work, an 80-hour week. So, yeah, there are a lot of good convenient options like that too.
Are there any things that are different because you're a woman? So obviously men can have, I imagine, different things to aim for, different restrictions. But what would you say is specifically for women when it comes to building muscle, fat loss, and trying to be healthier?
That's a really good question. So, from a biological perspective, with I guess there aren't really major differences between men and women in terms of how we respond to like various like training interventions. So there are going to be some baseline differences in like total skeletal muscle mass. So men are typically more muscular individuals because they are bigger individuals. Women do tend to have a disproportionately larger amount of their mass in their lower extremities relative to men. Men actually tend to carry a little bit more of their muscle mass in their upper bodies. But in terms of how we respond to different training, there are basically very few differences. So, the type of training program that would be effective for a male to build muscle are essentially the same training interventions that a female can use to build muscle as well. I think the biggest difference would just be maybe the muscle groups of interest. So I work with men and women, bodybuilders and just lifestyle clients as well. And I'd say that women generally, they're looking to grow their glutes, or they'd like to have, lean, muscular legs, or they might like to have, the shoulders. Maybe they follow along like my journey, and they like the look of the bikini competitors. So there's a strong emphasis there on, the capped shoulders. So I think the differences would be in terms of like the program design and the muscle groups that we target. Whereas males, I don't know that I've had any male athlete or just lifestyle male that said to me, "Oh, I really want to have great looking glutes." Though I think the women in their lives might say, "Hey, yeah, you should probably work on that." But they're normally coming to me and saying, "Hey, look, I really want to, grow my biceps. I want to get a bigger back, bigger chest." They're not as concerned about their, lower body, perhaps like women are. So, exercise selection and, of course, obviously then muscle group interests are a little bit different. So that's why their training programs would be different. Um, I think there's probably also some element of program enjoyment. I think men generally, I don't want to stereotype the guys here, but I think men tend to have a little bit more ego in the gym than women. And for that reason, I've certainly found I do a lot more programs that incorporate both strength and hypertrophy. So males, will probably do programming where they're working between a 1 rep max all the way through to like a 6 or an 8 rep max, which typically falls under the broad category of like strength training. So you're trying to maximize the amount of load that you can lift for that rep range. And then they'll also have some hypertrophy training in there as well, which is generally considered 8 reps and above. Whereas for females, it's not to say that I haven't worked and personally haven't done strength training programs for women, but I think most women that I work with are a little bit more interested in just the hypertrophy style of training. So there might be some subtle differences there, but again, that's not a biological or physiological difference. It's really just, perhaps conforming to like the gender and how society kind of views that and their interests. I will say women tend to be a little bit more fatigue resistant. And it might be one of the reasons why we maybe enjoy training or don't mind training with higher repetitions quite as much. And that might be due to our hormonal profiles. So, because women have more estrogen, we tend to, and we also have slightly greater increased capillarization as well. We're slightly better at muscle perfusion, which basically just means the delivery of blood to the working tissues and then the clearance from tissues, active tissue as well. So, as a result, that may actually influence the style of training that we choose because we are able to better clear some of those metabolic byproducts out of our muscle, which accumulate during, a high rep set. So if you do, say, 20 repetitions, on a leg extension, for instance, you start to kind of feel that burning sensation, that discomfort. That's basically a buildup of inorganic phosphate ions, hydrogen ions, and other metabolites. And women are, I guess, based on some of the research that we've read, are slightly better at being able to clear that from the tissues. So perhaps that is why, again, we see more males kind of opting for perhaps that lower rep range as their personal preference because it's not as uncomfortable, whereas females might be more tolerant to that just due to our decreased fatigue abilities. So yeah, outside of that, there aren't really any major differences. So I think, when it comes to setting up and choosing a training program, you first have to think about what muscle groups you are interested in building. That is very different to like how we would consider like training for fat loss. So I think a lot of people say, well, I want to get leaner arms or I'd like to look leaner, in my legs. That is taken care of essentially with the caloric deficit. But how we train like how we program our resistance training, that should always be focused on the muscle groups that you're either trying to grow or that you're trying to get strong. So, yeah, I think having a general idea about those muscle groups is important. And then the volume and the intensity at which we train is also really critical. So, again, there's no differences between men and women here. At least based on the research we have to date, I have not seen anything that would indicate otherwise. But generally speaking, for people that are brand new to resistance training, they are able to, I guess, respond relatively well to low training volumes. So up to about 15 working sets per muscle group per week tends to be a sufficient amount of stimulus to help somebody grow muscle. Whereas once we become more kind of steady state resistance trained, we've got a little bit more experience, the amount of stimulus required to signal a muscle to grow does seem to increase. And unfortunately, what we're seeing, or maybe it's a fortunate thing, there is a bit of a ceiling. So it's not like the more you do indefinitely, you'll just continue to see results. There are diminishing returns beyond a certain threshold of volume each week. And that is because, as humans, like we have biological breaks, that are trying to slow us down. Like your body is not meant to be like the Incredible Hulk. It would be an incredibly energy inefficient way to live. So I think from an evolutionary perspective, it's important that we have these biological breaks. Otherwise, you could potentially enlarge your heart, and it would contribute to probably early death for a number of reasons if you were carrying too much muscle. So yeah, I think there's a certain point for advanced lifters where we do need to do more volume. But, beyond a certain point, and right now, based on the research that we have, that seems to be about 45 sets, and we are not really seeing a whole lot more, muscle growth beyond that. There was a study by Ennis and colleagues just a couple of years ago here, and they did a study where the highest group were training up to about 52 sets per week. So I believe that is the study with the most amount of training volume ever recorded. That's not to say that there aren't individuals out there who have done higher than that, but at least in a scientific research setting, that seems to be about the highest we've ever seen. And then the next group that were, like, I guess, a step down from that came in at about 42 sets by the end of their training cycle. But there were no statistical differences between those two groups when we look at the hypertrophy outcomes. So, the question is the juice worth the squeeze? Probably not. So yeah, I think for anybody that's a little bit more advanced in their training, at least the way that I would recommend it to clients and what I do personally, is, somewhere between 20 and 30 sets per muscle group per week seems to be about the sweet spot, provided that the intensity is high, so you're putting in a lot of effort, and that you are training very close or to failure. And I think that is a critical piece because I've been in the gym a lot over the years with, clients and observing them train. And, I'll ask them to set up the weights as they would usually do it on their own. I want to watch you do a set. And there have been so many instances where I have, encouraged that person to do, 3 more reps, 4 more reps, 5 more reps, maybe 10 more reps with that same load when they're being challenged. And the reality is, if you are not training at a rate of perceived exertion somewhere between 7 and 10, meaning maybe 3 reps in the tank, 2 reps in the tank, 1 rep in the tank before meeting failure, then you're probably not going to be getting the signaling for muscle growth that is optimal. And I think that's where, a lot of people, if they're, not confident in the gym or they're training distracted, that's where, people start to spin their wheels because they're not training with the intensity that should actually allow them to grow muscle. They're just burning calories, which, has benefits from a health perspective, and hopefully an enjoyment perspective. But yeah, if they're not training with that high degree of intensity, there's the very likeliness that you're not going to get the muscle growth response that you're interested in. So, yeah, I think just to kind of summarize my thoughts there, beginners up to about 15 sets per week per muscle group would be important. For more advanced lifters, I think, at least the way that I'd recommend it based on the research, it would be somewhere between 20 and 30 sets per muscle group per week, and try to distribute that across the week as evenly as you can. I would not be recommending trying to do all of that over 1 or 2 days, because there's going to be, again, a point where within a single session, you're not able to stimulate any more muscle growth. So beyond, say, 6 to 9 working sets taken to failure, that muscle has already been successfully activated and fatigued. It's got maximal signaling. Doing more isn't going to lead to more muscle growth. So I think the analogy I like to use there is, once you've turned your car on, like if you turn the key a little further, it's not going to do anything else for the experience driving the car. It's already on. So I kind of look at your resistance training in it in a similar fashion. So this is where, for more advanced lifters, if they are wanting to really bring up a lot of their muscle groups, it's not feasible to fit it all in just a couple of training sessions. That's why we start to see, 5-day training plans, 6-day training plans, to be able to fit it in and it be effective. Otherwise, you could be training, over fewer days, but there are diminishing returns beyond a certain point. So yeah, I hope that kind of brings some light to the conversation, at least around training volume.
I find it quite interesting actually because it's making me think, okay, well, maybe if we recover better, then we're more likely to be able to fit all of this in, possibly train at a higher intensity. Is recovery important? I mean, it's leaning towards a yes, let's say. But how important is it?
Look, I think recovery is incredibly important. I personally would advise, and again, the research would indicate that for a muscle to fully recover, you probably need about 36 hours, between bouts. But here's what I will say. just because you're going into the gym and you are not fully recovered, let's say you trained yesterday at 7 p.m. and you're heading back to the gym, the very next day, it's 5 p.m. So it hasn't really been a full 24 hours and you are training the same muscle group. It's not that going in and doing that workout again, or at least hitting that same muscle group, is going to yield zero benefits. It's very possible, though I can't, give you, any scientific data to back this up. But my hypotheses would be that you're probably not going to get the same kind of signaling. And again, think about those biological breaks. If there has been some kind of damage to the muscle, it's very likely that you're not going to get the same kind of response, if it is still, not repaired fully. So I think you can still go in and train that same muscle group again, but it probably depends on a number of different variables. How much volume did you do the day before? How was your nutrition? How was your sleep? And ultimately you can probably still train that muscle to failure again the next day, but are we going to get the same kind of hypertrophy response as if we had have left a full day in between? It's difficult to say. And I don't know that I've read many studies or research that have specifically tackled this in the way that you and I like practically would implement recovery. Maybe that's an idea for some budding young researchers who are interested in looking at this. But as far as how it really directly impairs or impacts our ability to grow, I haven't personally read anything that would indicate that it's not possible to grow in an under-recovered state. I think what you would find is that the reason it's recommended is because of the increased risk of injury. So if you've got a damaged muscle that needs more time to recover and to repair, if you decide to go in and lift heavy the very next day without any modification to the load, there is probably an increased risk of, injuring that muscle group. So I still do train back to back. I mean, I don't intend it to be that way all the time, but just due to scheduling reasons. I mean, just this very last week, I think I trained Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, 4 days back to back. They're big training programs. There's 10 exercises in my programs at the moment. And there's a lot of repetitiveness on specific muscle groups because I do bikinis. So I have to focus on the glutes and the shoulders. So I was certainly sore by day 3 and day 4, but it didn't render me, unable to do the work. But by day 3 and day 4, I definitely made some compromises to the load that I chose because I don't want to injure myself. It's also very uncomfortable. I don't know that I'd be able to lift the same kinds of weights, if I'd been going really hard and training to failure on those earlier sessions in the week. Injury risk aside, the other thing that would be problematic is if you had any strength goals. So again, I work with a lot of strength athletes as well. I've also done powerlifting in my own career too. You would not be able to perform to the best of your ability. So performance would be compromised. Your maximum loads would be compromised. So again, I have a lot of people that I work with that, love looking at their volume over the course of their 6-week training mesocycle, and they're always, trying to make some small improvements. But if there were a period for whatever reason where they did back-to-back training, I can assure you now, like we would probably see that number taper off a little bit and possibly dip down due to improper rest time. So I think for anyone that's striving for performance and, a positive lift, or you're aiming for maximum strength, that would be a major consideration. Again, because I personally am not so concerned about, hitting massive loads at the moment because I'm not so much interested in powerlifting or maximum strength. I'm more worried about the consistency of hitting that muscle group, getting enough signaling so that the muscle growth continues to happen or is at least maintained, so that I can kind of come into a competition, with a good amount of muscle.
Do you find then that it's almost more important to train smarter versus harder? The amount of people that you would see in the gym that would lift as much as they can, as often as they can, and then just the results will be what they may, versus the smarter lifter, they probably don't even look like they're breaking a sweat half the time, and yet they're still just consistent and doing their thing, if that makes sense. How important is it to do that? How important do we need to be smart about it? Do we need to be a bit more thoughtful? And what are some of the contrasting results between the two?
Yeah, I mean, that's a major consideration. And it's really interesting that you bring that up because I know, again, from my background personally, and I work with a lot of people that do the same thing. When I was competitively powerlifting, where you are trying to lift as much weight as you possibly can for a single repetition. So, your training is geared towards that. Like it's trying to encourage your positive neurological adaptations to get as strong as you possibly can be. So, the training, matches that intensity. Whereas for something like bodybuilding or muscle growth, based on the research, and there was also a recent meta-analysis that kind of confirmed this, whether you train at an RPE of 7 or an RPE of 10, so rate of perceived exertion is the RPE, there doesn't seem to be meaningful differences in growth adaptations. So if we were to look at all the studies where some took their participants to failure, some, used 2 reps shy, repetitions in reserve, all the way down to 3 repetitions in reserve or an RP of 7, there really don't seem to be significant differences in the muscle growth response. So with that in mind, that was a huge, like a game changer for me as somebody that kind of grew up as an athlete because, I've always had the mentality of go hard or go home. I think many of us have, been raised that way, perhaps if you've got an athletic background. So it was comforting to know that, I don't actually have to go 100% every time I'm in the gym, and I mean, it's intense when you have to train like that. So it's allowed me to train at a lower intensity, and arguably that probably keeps me healthier in terms of reducing the risk of injury, which allows me to consistently show up to my training, get the volumes in that I need, to continue making, progress and muscle growth. And show up, consistently at shows. Whereas if I was training with the intensity of 10 all the time, and trying to max out, I probably would eventually injure myself. And I have done bodybuilding preps like that too, because I loved powerlifting. I do more of a hybrid approach. So, I'd go in and do my compound lifts first, and I'd be hitting like my 6 rep maxes and 4 rep maxes at the beginning to maximize my strength outcomes. And then I would switch over to hypertrophy. But I can say that I was arguably much sore training that way. I would get a lot more like joint issues and just bone aches, if you will, from the powerlifting. And I don't do that anymore because I think to be competitive as a bodybuilder, like you need longevity, you need sustainability. So yeah, I don't program RPE 10 ever in my programs at this point in my career. It's about being able to maximize volume on specific muscle groups, and train at a space where I know I can still grow, but I'm not causing injuries. So yeah, I think what you said makes perfect sense. I think train smarter, not harder in this particular scenario where muscle growth is the primary goal.
Is it the same for fat loss as well? Like if you consider the women that you've worked with or that you can see in the gym, how is it with fat loss? I feel like it could be dead easy to tip into the RPE nines and tens because let's say you're cardio focused. It might be so
Yep.
easy to think, well, am I actually working hard at all if I'm not going to the eights and nines because you might not even feel it working.
Yeah, so again, I think there's something to be said for a sustainable approach. I think depending on the person's lifestyle, some folks have greater capacity to operate at a higher intensity and good for them. I used to be able to do that, but my lifestyle and circumstances have changed quite a bit over the years. So there are going to be folks that are able to, create a aggressive caloric deficit. They're willing and able to implement quite a degree of caloric restriction and also put in a lot of work in times of their commitment to training, whether it's resistance training and or cardio. Um, but it doesn't make it a superior approach. If all paths lead to the same outcome, then I think choose the path that allows you to get there. And I think most of us would like to be able to get there and then sustain it. So, generally speaking, the way that I encourage clients and the way that I even do my own contest preps is to choose an approach that you know you can stick to long term. So, the way that I like to eat in my off season, I take that kind of an approach to how I set up my nutrition for my fat loss phases. If I know that I am a lover of, I don't know, pizza and I enjoy sweets and I like to go out and have a glass of wine and cocktail on the weekend, with friends. If that's something that I want to be able to do, then I also try to practice those types of behaviors as I'm going through, my fat loss phase. So what that then looks like is there isn't a whole lot of like extreme caloric restriction. I have a lot of flexibility, and I don't necessarily set myself up with an extremely aggressive weekly rate of weight loss goal. It's something that I can do sustainably, consistently, week over week over week. Of course, as calories come down, there's always going to be some minor modifications to the quantities of the foods that I like to eat. But generally, anything that requires extreme behavior adjustments and that doesn't really align with, your normal lifestyle choices and food choices isn't going to be something that's sustainable long term. So, after the diet's done, great. Then what's next? If you don't like the way that you've chosen to diet, you're probably not going to be able to maintain that body composition. So, that's certainly been one of the things that I have adjusted personally over the years. Instead of being, extremely aggressive and restrictive, which most people can do for a short period of time. I've realized that that's not going to work for me long term. If I want to maintain a leaner physique, also have other interests outside of the sport of bodybuilding, I need to find an approach that feels sustainable. And there are so many ways that you can do that. So, generally speaking, when it comes to setting like a targeted rate of weight loss, up to about 1.2% of your body weight per week seems to be safe and efficacious in that it doesn't compromise your protein or energy requirements, and it allows people to get a good variety of micronutrients and thus prevents micronutrient deficiencies. But once we kind of push beyond those types of percentage rates of weight loss, that's when, we start to see problems. So as a rule of thumb, anything below that is a reasonable target to work towards. But in all of the years that I've coached, I think the most popular or common outcome of dieting sees people land somewhere between like 0.4 and 0.6% of their body weight per week. If we look at weight loss over 20 weeks or 24 weeks or something like this, the average tends to come out around those numbers. But we might have started more aggressive, but life gets in the way. You've got events, you've got travel, you've got things that kind of pop up. And it's not really sustainable to state those higher targets. So that's generally like the rules or principles that I would implement with clients. And it seems to do them well with busy lifestyles, at least.
It sounds like it's such a web of information and strategies, and here's some of the things we can do, and trying to be more sustainable. And I like the way that you described it as people would eventually even out or plateau to an extent, as if you start off so intense that you simply can't sustain it, but you're likely to find a happy medium somewhere in within the range that you can actually stick to.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what sort of things would you suggest for your top tips then? So if you've got someone that wants to build muscle, they want to lose fat as well, they want to get healthier, they want the body that people tend to come to you that they want, what would be your best pieces of advice for them? So if they walked in, never met them before, what would be your sort of top 3 to 5 things you would tell them?
I think for most individuals, having an added amount of lean tissue is going to be wildly beneficial. Yes, there are some nice aesthetic benefits, but I think even more importantly, what muscle will do for your long-term health, especially your metabolic health. So, with that in mind, I generally recommend people start with a muscle building phase. That doesn't mean that you're not going to see improvements in your body composition, but because keep in mind, as we start to add more muscle, if we didn't change somebody's inputs, like how much they're eating, as this body is starting to demand more calories and energy to support that increased muscle mass, then we do start to see fat mass go down. So the scale number may not change a whole lot, but we are seeing major improvements over, a time course of 12 months in terms of their body composition. So I think people underestimate the value of sticking to a building phase in how it can actually support and facilitate fat loss. So that's usually what I would recommend. And I would encourage them to do that as long as they possibly could, unless there is something that they urgently need to change in terms of fat mass. And sometimes there is like a medical requirement for fat loss. I've worked with people that are overweight and obese, and they have a number of comorbidities. Their blood biomarkers are outside of the normal healthy reference ranges, and we do need to take action quickly. So in those scenarios, there are certainly going to be benefits for, moving them into a weight loss phase. But it doesn't mean that we deny the importance of resistance training in this piece of the puzzle. We do them simultaneously. So that can certainly be done as well. But the downside is when we enter into caloric restriction, the amount of muscle that can be built is likely going to be compromised to a certain extent. And again, it would come back to the individual's, makeup, because at higher body fat percentages, there is less risk of lean tissue loss during a fat loss phase. So for those folks, they're actually able to relatively successfully build muscle and lose fat at the same time. But for leaner individuals, I wish that I could give you a perfect number of, oh no, if you fall below this percentage body fat, then I'm at risk. But we don't have good data. In fact, my lab here at the University of South Florida are about to do this very study, and I'll share more about that in a minute. But I think prioritizing the muscle building phase is really important. And, if you're in a position where there are medical requirements for you to make changes to your fat mass, then some kind of fat loss phase would be, a good start. But I think doing it in a way that is sustainable and, not too much of a crazy lifestyle adjustment. But there have been cases where people have needed to make major adjustments to their lifestyle choices, because the alternative might leave them, not in a really great place. So, yeah, as far as our lab is concerned, we actually are going to be doing a study later this year that looks at different body compositions and how we respond to resistance training under different states of energy balance. So, for example, we will be specifically looking at lean individuals that are less than 15% body fat, males and females, and we'll be looking at how they respond to a fixed resistance training program, where some of the people will be in a caloric deficit, some will be at maintenance calories, and some will be in a small surplus. We'd love to get a better idea about how people do respond that are lean. We do have some data on individuals at a normal healthy weight and or obese, but the data is lacking in terms of like direct methods of or measures of muscle growth. So we have a lot of DEXA studies available that kind of have looked at these things, but their accuracy in really determining what's happening like on a muscular level is limited because DEXA are unable to distinguish the difference between the non-fat tissues. So, for instance, people will come to me and they're like, oh, I had my DEXA on the weekend. I look like I'm 4 pounds more muscle. And I'll have to say to them, well, that actually includes glycogen, water, hair, skin, nails, organs, and connective tissue. And those things are very sensitive, to our diet and to our training. So right now, if we look to most of the data that's kind of interested in these kinds of muscle growth outcomes, we're not really using the right measuring tools to say accurately, whether or not the intervention is effective or not. So I'm actually really excited to be, heading up this next research that will focus on these outcomes with more direct methods of muscle growth. So we use ultrasound and or MRI.
Wow, so we need to learn more about this lab then. So talk to us about it. What's the name of the company? How can people get involved?
Yeah, so it's actually the University of South Florida. So I'm affiliated with that group here. So based in Tampa in Florida. So it's the university. But yeah, I guess we will be putting out information probably over the next couple of months just on my social media, asking for people to get involved. I think the biggest challenge is that research is done best and with fewer limitations when we can keep it in the lab. So it will unfortunately limit people to being local to Tampa and that are willing to drive and train with us. But essentially, it'll be a comprehensive study that you basically will be given 12 weeks of training, coaching, and nutrition intervention for free. But you just have to come to the lab, 4 times a week, or at least half of that, I think, for the muscles that we're going to be measuring. But yeah, I'll be putting up some information about that on my social media platform soon when we're looking to get started. But right now, we're doing a pilot study that basically assesses our reliability of measuring the glutes and the shoulders. Those are the muscle groups that I'm personally interested in. I think a lot of women are interested in those muscle groups, but when you look to research in general, women are understudied, and there's certainly very few studies that cover the glutes and the shoulders. So this intervention will be most interested in those muscle growth outcomes. But in order to run the full study, we want to make sure first that the way that we're measuring the glutes and the shoulders is reliable. So we will do a reliability study first. So yeah, that's kind of underway at the moment.
How can people find out more about you as well, Holly? So have you got a website, social media?
Yeah, so I am most active on YouTube. I do lots of long form content on there about different studies and things that have come out that are usually related to women and between like 30 and 60. That's kind of my niche, but I probably get into the weeds with studies that the guys like too. But yeah, my YouTube's just Holly T Baxter. My Instagram is exactly the same. And you'll be able to find all of my website links, links to our research review, books, and workout apps. All those things can be found right there in Instagram and in YouTube.
Thanks so much for being a guest on the show. Those that are listening, feel free to subscribe, share the show, tell others, and also leave a review wherever you are listening into your podcasts. Holly, thanks so much. It's been great. I really enjoyed this, and I look forward to keeping in touch. Thank you.
Thank you.